Love Your Kitchen, Design in the Heart of the Home, proudly sponsored by Blum, the podcast where we explore the art of crafting your dream kitchen. I'm your host, Faye Newman, a freelance kitchen designer with a passion for creating spaces that truly reflect the heart of the home. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Love Your Kitchen podcast. As ever, thank you very much for joining me. So today's episode is going to be split into two because there is so much to go through regarding this topic, which is navigating the bumps in the road that, occurs in pretty much any renovation projects, that you undertake. Naturally, because this is the Love Your Kitchen podcast, there's going to be a focus on kitchen renovations, but hopefully sort of at the end of both episodes, you'll just have, better sort of knowledge on, what sort of potential factors will need to be considered in order to allow for a more streamlined, I say stress-free renovation, but I don't want to set your hopes too high because renovations are just really stressful, but I just want to give you as much information as I can to try and make it as easy as possible for you, throughout that stressful time. So the episode that we're talking about today is going to be about the structural elements within your space. So what needs to be considered and what will be considered as structural over something that you might not need a structural engineer for. So we'll just be going through some talking points for that and some examples. I'll also be talking about the factors that, your trades need to know. So I'll be talking about what factors your builders need to know from a kitchen perspective, what factors your, kitchen fitter will need to know, and then also other trades as well, and talk about sort of, time frames and parameters. So hopefully you can just gain, a good understanding on how the renovation process sort of interlinks and works. The second episode that will launch next week will be all about sort of the things to consider sort of initially in your choices, so that when you say if something does happen from a renovation perspective and you know who to call, who to go to. So it's just making sure that you've got the knowledge of how to sort of manage that situation if it does happen. Hopefully it doesn't, but it might. And then also I'll talk about, some top tips and advice to think about, to again, forward think, anything that could potentially, delay or just, could potentially alter your design, which of course we don't want. So we'll just manage everything, pop everything down for you and talk about it today so that by the end of both episodes, you've just got a full understanding of everything and it will just make the sort of renovation process a lot easier for you. Let's start with the build and initial design phase then. So when you say build, this can be whether you're doing a self-build project, you might be converting a barn, you might be extending out, from your, existing property, and you might have part of the existing kitchen sort of within that space to consider. And also it might be a case of you're keeping your kitchen in the existing space, but there's a few structural elements that may need to be changed in order to, enhance that space and make it work better for you. So let's talk about what's actually considered to be a structural change within your kitchen. Naturally, removing a structural wall is an easy one. If you've got a wall that is bearing, weight and holding up, a floor above it, naturally that's going to be a lot of work sort of to take out. Yes, your builder can help with that, but usually you need a structural engineer to identify sort of the steel needed. So you can fix your steel to, to the ceiling, and then you've got pillars either side usually that need to be accounted for in the design. Sometimes you can hide the RSJ in the ceiling if you've got the ceiling height. Equally, if not, that might be a design consideration that's needed to be incorporated within that particular space. And this happens all the time as well. So it's just, working with your designer to work around those factors. Second would be taking out a supporting pillar. Again, so changing this to a steel. That works as well. So say if you've got a pillar that's in the middle of an island, for instance, Sometimes you can take that out and then put it on a sort of a horizontal pillar, so therefore you haven't got that interruption. However, a lot of design, especially if it's a really big building, quite a big property, if you're taking out, say, like 3 walls that are all sort of connected and then you're putting it into a big open plan space, sometimes you just have to live with that pillar. And equally, that's when it's all about, making your sort of kitchen design around that pillar and sort of making it part of the kitchen design as well, so it looks less intrusive sort of when you're walking in. I've got a great example of this as well, which I'll show you, just so you can see how that's integrated really well, within the island. So if you're watching, you'll be able to see that on the screen. Third one is increasing the ceiling height or trying to bring your ceiling down to meet a structural pillar. So of course, any sort of adaptations to the ceiling, it's going to, if you wanted to make that sort of higher or lower, as we said, to make a RSJ coming down the ceiling sort of flush, that's going to be considered structural. Another one would be widening and making a new position for windows. So naturally, if you're just replacing an existing window and the size is the same, you're all fine, because that window's not actually holding any sort of weight on it, so to speak. But if you're looking to maybe add a beautiful big picture window or something, just to add a little bit of light into a different part of the room, but equally you've just got to make sure that that new positioning of the window is not affecting any of the the weight going onto that existing wall. It still needs to make sure that that's distributed correctly, so that there's not going to be any movement over time. And also you want to make sure that obviously everything is structurally sound. Removing a supporting chimney breast. So this is a big one and will probably occur more so in, say, like your barn conversions, or any sort of older properties that has a big chimney breast, usually sort of in the middle of the house or in the middle of the room, and that is supporting usually. So sometimes in designs we create a beautiful chimney breast just out of stud work, but there's actually no sort of load bearing on that structure. Whereas, as I've mentioned, with conversions or anything like that, you've normally got a big chimney breast or some sort of structure within that space that obviously heated the property all those years ago. But it can be quite a big job to change, and that's something that definitely a structural engineer will need to help with alongside your builder on how to navigate, past and move that weight and support around the house. So in some cases as well, looking at your flooring and making sure that actually some of the pipe work, if you're cutting out sort of new pipe work into different areas, and say that that floor isn't directly on the ground, maybe if there's a cellar beneath it, or it's maybe the second floor in a property, which it can be sometimes, it's just making sure that all of those sort of holes in the floor joists and things won't affect the actual structure of the room. So just be mindful of that as well. So those are sort of the common, indications of what parts of your renovation would be considered to be sort of structural, and what you would need to get sort of a structural engineer to help with alongside, a good builder. Factors your builder will need to know in regards to your kitchen projects. So when you're starting to get a design together with your chosen designer, obviously you'll have a floor plan with the location of everything. So what I'll talk about here is, the factors that are really important for your builder to know, so that you're not having to rush certain elements of the design and rush decisions, just to make you sort of forward see, what they will need sort of at what stage. So say if you're doing an extension project, for instance, and you're doing, underfloor heating, anything like that, naturally your fitter is going to need to know the layout of the space as they're laying, or before they lay the underfloor heating. So it's just talking through what they'll need to know, and then different circumstances to help you sort of navigate that process. So of course they will need to know the position of the island. So if you're adding any sort of appliance on the island, of course, if it's like a sink, we need to make sure that you can actually get plumbing to it. If you've got a dishwasher, again, we've got to make sure that you've got enough for the waste for the sink, and then of course the water coming out of the tap, and then the same for the dishwasher. So that's a factor to consider. If it's a case of you are having a venting hub, on your island, they're really popular now. You've obviously got to think about the ducting for that appliance as well. So for instance, if your venting is going down, you've obviously got to think about the ducting going outside the back of the appliance, down to the floor, and then back out somewhere. So it's usually sort of like a C shape, dependent on where your external wall is. So if your external wall is behind you, it'll go back, down, and like back out, outside to that external wall. It might need to turn at an angle, at a right angle, and go out to, say, if you've got bifold doors on the left hand side as well. It's just all dependent, but it's great for your builder to forward see this before he gets there, to make sure that there's enough one room to duct, dependent on like your floor joists and things like that. But also just, he knows the format, and he knows sort of which ducting is needed in order to accommodate, what you're going for. If it's a case of you're sort of being told that it's probably too far to duct to, don't be too sort of disappointed with that. The filters now for the recirculating kits for the venting hubs are really good. So they're a lot better than what they used to be. A lot of showrooms that have working kitchens, showcase this, and it's normally a filter sort of system. And, it still takes out the odour. It's, still sort of the same extraction rate and things like that. Of course, it's just not ducting the air straight out. If it's a case of you are doing it on a filter process, it usually, what happens for a venting hub is it goes out the back, down to the floor, and then it comes back out at plinth level. So you have a little plinth vent at the bottom of your island. But by the time it comes out and back into the room, of course, it's filtered through. So you're not going to have horrible odour-filled sort of, air going onto your feet while you're cooking. So something to consider there. But again, speaking to your builder and just making him aware of, these factors prior to, your kitchen being installed is really important. Underfloor heating is another factor. So they will need to know, the exact positioning of all of your furniture in order to lay sort of the underfloor heating. So it's not advised to put underfloor heating underneath any sort of built-in furniture, purely because then, of course, over time, sort of the heat could get into the material and it could potentially warp and move a little bit. So you can get mats to put over the top of it if you want to, if you've got certain spots within the room where you've extended slightly more over, or your island's in a slightly different position. So it's not the end of the world. However, best practice is to foresee this with your builder. And then also it means that you can navigate around sort of the, make sure there's no cold spots in the room as well. I think that's one of the biggest things that I've noticed, with projects and clients that I've worked with and spoken to over the years, is if they've had to rush sort of the layout in order to think about their underfloor heating, sometimes they're just left with like a big strip of cold spot. And it's just a shame that if you're investing so much money into doing underfloor heating anyway, of course you want to make sure that that's working, everywhere for you. Equally, you might want some cold spots if you've got any pets and they want, if they've got any water to drink or food. If you've got any dog bowls down, you obviously want to make sure that that's not heating the water to like a lukewarm level. So it might be desirable to have those cold spots, but it's giving yourself that choice and making sure that, you're organised enough by the time you get to that point. Position of the new extractor fan and if it's been ducted. So of course I've said obviously if it's vented, but again, if you're going for something sort of, ceiling extraction, if you're going for anything that's flush fitting, they're really popular. If you want to go for, sometimes you can go for a hub that has, 3 different sections all combined together, and maybe the extraction isn't, on the work surface, it's, you want it to go up. a ceiling extractor, you know, sometimes you can have them painted in the same sort of colour as your ceiling, so it looks really discreet. You've obviously got to make sure the infrastructure above where that is can hold the ceiling extractor from a weight perspective, but also if you've got any sort of, you know, ceiling sort of joists going down, you want to make sure that you're navigating around those as well. Equally, any sort of pendant lights or anything that you're trying to build down to create like a really nice extractor section, again, just need to make your builder aware of it. Even if you're not going for a venting extractor or a ceiling extractor, your builder will still need to know. If you're going for a wall mounted, they'll still need to know the sort of the position of it. And it's always good to locate the existing ducting hole, just so from an exterior perspective, obviously they'll need to patch up a existing ducting hole if your extractor fan is then being moved to the side. So just be aware of where that's located at the moment, and see if you can use that existing. If not, you know, speak to your builder and then see and make sure that the new spot can be ducted where it is. Of course, it doesn't always need to be on an external wall. You can, if you've got sort of shelving or cabinets leading on from where the extractor is, you can run a 3-meter ducting out, you know, the side of the property if you want to. But again, it's just talking to your builder and then sorting out the logistics so that when it comes to fitting, you're not having to think about having, you know, a ducting kit through your cabinets. It's all been foreseen. Or it might be a case of, you know, outside, as I mentioned, externally, you can just see where the first one's been patched up and then the other one's just a little bit over. So it's just forward thinking it a little bit more. Of course, another factor to think about is any existing plumbing and wire placements. So sort of understanding sort of where those all are at the moment, checking if they're still in use for you, but also your neighbours. So I've had a client that I've worked with, bless them, and they were amazing. I did sort of the kitchen design for them, but I know that they had a lot of bumps within their sort of renovation. I think it was just the type of house and the age of the property. Those were the ones that needed to adapt. You know, they had a big chimney breast in the space, so they had to sort of remove that because that was a structural element that would interfere with the design too much. So they've moved that out, and that caused, you know, bits of cracking and things and movement. So they've had sort of lots to think about for that. They also had some lead pipes that they thought weren't in use anymore, and then they've cut into those, and it's actually still the neighbour still accessing water through those pipes. So there's lots going on, and that's what's caused, you know, some delays for them. So it's trying to, again, foresee everything and just making sure that your builder is looking at the existing plumbing, the wiring placements, and then seeing how that needs to be adapted sort of within your new design. New positioning or widening of windows. As I mentioned, this is a structural change. So naturally, if you're looking at, you know, repositioning a window, it's just checking with your builder to see whether that can be done. Maybe you want to make it slightly bigger if you want a bit more natural light. Or it might be a case of, I mean, I've worked with a couple before that was just, they had one window looking out onto sort of their neighbour's fence, and then they had beautiful big bifolds on the other end where they had sort of their conservatory. And for them, they just didn't want to look at the neighbour's fence anymore. And it wasn't, they had quite a lot of sort of, you know, lighting going into that one kitchen space. So what they did, they had a rectangular window, just a normal sort of, I think it was either a 2 or 3 sort of panelled glazing, you know, a window above where, or by their sink section. And what they did was they just made that into a letterbox window. So therefore they're still getting the natural light that they need within that space, but therefore they're not having to look directly at a fence all the time, which again is a really great thing to identify, because then within the sort of sleek, seamless quality of the design, it just meant that they could have their splashback going all the way across at the same height underneath their wall cabinets, going, you know, at an L shape going round to where underneath the window. So again, it just worked for them from a design perspective, but it still gave them the natural light that they needed within that space. If you're looking to do a change similar to that, naturally, because you're putting a new window within the existing space, there shouldn't be any sort of structural sign-offs or anything needed for that. But again, it will just be sort of leaning on your builder a little bit and just being like, actually, we're thinking about this, like, what sort of things do we need to consider? What sort of delays, may occur, especially if you're going for like bespoke colours for windows and glazing and that sort of thing. Just organise yourself enough so that you've got, time for those factors to be taken into account. Something to think about is if there is a delay of your glazing, that will delay the furniture coming into that room from a kitchen supplier perspective. So it's really important for kitchen suppliers to not deliver your kitchen until a space is completely watertight. And that's not them being, funny. It's just them saying, the humidity needs to be at a certain level within a room in order to allow for, the kitchen furniture to be delivered and fitted within that space. You've got to think about a tall end panel, which is over 2 meters. It's 18 mil thick. So it's quite a thin but tall panel. And usually, if it's left on a site where there's a lot of moisture in the air, they can warp and bend over time. So it's just to foresee, that happening and making sure everything's watertight before getting to the installation. So something to note from there. Also looking at what lighting or appliance structure may be hung from the ceiling. So I've spoken about this with obviously like the ceiling extractors, but even for pendant lighting, and, elements like that, decorative elements like that, it's understanding sort of how many you need, what's the weight of those. Some of those can be really heavy, dependent on how far and, how big a statement you want to go. So just making sure that your builder's aware of that, and just understanding of, looking at the maybe additional support that might be needed to potentially hold those up. Again, if they're pendants like this, it should be absolutely fine. But again, always good just to check. So that's the factors that your builder will need to know. Then we lead on to, once the sort of the foundations are laid, obviously the walls are built, not necessarily the glazing's put in at this stage, but the screed's laid, you're getting to a point where you're starting to see a building come together. That's when you could potentially, engage with a fitter and see, get them to do a check measure, whether that's through a company or maybe your designer will come and do a check measure, depending on which kitchen supplier you're working with. But it's just knowing now at this stage what your fitter will need to know in order to be able to fit accurately within that space. So the first element is the finished ceiling height after the flooring and ceiling board has been put on. So naturally, it's always best during any check measure for the finished heights to be in place. So this, when I say that, obviously your ceiling board, if it needs to be boarded, is already boarded, not necessarily plastered, because you can sort of account for a bit of plaster. Your flooring, if it's a case of you're laying your flooring afterwards, if you can get sort of a self-leveler down, just so we can measure sort of the exact height from the floor to the ceiling in different areas, especially if you're going for, really tall furniture and maybe it might be quite tight on the top, or if you're looking to sort of scribe to ceiling, that's really important just to understand sort of the heights needed on top of the furniture in order to, supply a plinth or a panel to bring it up to the ceiling heights. Also, the same goes for the wall dimensions. So this is really relevant if it's any wall-to-wall dimension, but you've got to make sure that the plasterboard has been taken into consideration, and that any plaster work that can bring, say a wall-to-wall section can bring it sort of 35 mil into the space. This is usually for any new parts of the room. So if you're going into your existing kitchen and say you're having something structural to the other end of the room that isn't affecting sort of, the kitchen space, usually, if you've got cabinets wall to wall at the moment, you would just rip those out and then sort of, skim and replaster over those points. So I wouldn't be too alarmed about it if that's your circumstance. But if it's a case of you've got part of the new extension and then you've got part of the existing room, naturally you're going to have no plasterboard needed in the existing space, just skim plaster But then in the new space, that will need to be insulated, boarded, and then skimmed over. So it's just understanding sort of, what the thickness of that is. The term sort of within the UK is called dot and dab. Usually it's about 35 mil. So it's just understanding, how wide that will be, from your builder's perspective, like get them to give you, a good estimate, or wait until it's all plasterboarded and then get your check measure sorted for the furniture. Thereafter, that's best practice if you can. But some instances when you're doing a renovation, because you want the kitchen, say if it's a bespoke kitchen especially, so it's not just a sort of off the shelf or 2 to 3 week lead time. If you're waiting 3 months for a kitchen, there are going to be circumstances where you will have to, do a bit of, I say guesswork, but be as accurate as you can within those parameters. So if you're doing the build, it's sort of like a chicken and egg scenario where you don't really want to wait for the kitchen to be delivered before then, you're starting to plasterboard the space. So all I would say in that, in that sort of situation is just speak to your builder and then get them to identify an allowance that they will make on the sides, and sort of give yourself a bit of give as well. Like if you can add sort of a little bit more to your sort of your fillers or your scribes into the wall, just to allow that, differentiation if it occurs, then that's normally good practice. I've also heard before about people just like missing out a cabinet as well, just to make sure that that's all sorted. But again, if you're on a longer lead time, that would just delay sort of your worktops and everything. So I would just stick to communicating it with your builder, working with your designer to make sure everything's lined up correctly, sort of where the furniture position is, and just give yourself allowances sort of either side. I worked on a big project for a couple of my clients, and the situation that we had was quite a difficult one, because we had their main run in the kitchen was wall to wall, but it was a really big wall. Part of it was in the existing kitchen, part of it was in the new extension, and we had the mantle on a wall, as well as wanting to line the tap dead centre to where the window is. So there was a lot of factors to consider. So sort of what we had to do was work back from the existing wall for the mantle and sort of figure out that positioning. And then again, work back from the new extension wall for the sink and be like, okay, so, if your dot and dab is this much, it's this thick, like this is the parameter that we need to stick to. And then, building off from that, you've got the movement in order to do it. So it's one of those heart-wrenching things that us as designers have to sort of sign off, but you've just got to look at it from sort of a logical perspective and then work back from there in order to get sort of the outcome that you're after. But yeah, it's just working with your design team and your builder for that one. Again, so another factor that your fitter will need to know is where the existing plumbing wire placements are, also gas location as well. So naturally, if you're just doing up your existing space, you won't necessarily need a builder for anything. It will be your fitter, potentially doing sort of the rip out of your existing kitchen, getting the first fix of electric sorted through an electrician, and then getting your plumbing and things in place. So them sort of knowing before everything's ripped out, sort of what's behind the doors, like the pipe work, that sort of thing, like them sort of understanding where everything is will just make that rip out side of things, a lot easier. And you will just know from a cost perspective then, like everything that's involved within sort of the new location of your plumbing and your wiring. Also boiler placement as well. So naturally they need to know if there's a boiler within the space, if it's going to be moved out of the space, whether that's new sort of or existing. Again, extractor fan, they need to know who is part of the ducting. So is the ducting being supplied from the kitchen supplier? If you've got a builder, is the ducting being supplied by your builder? Identifying between the two of them, the builder and the fitter, who is fitting the ducting. That is something that is always missed off, and it's always like, no, it's this person's job, no, it's this person's job. But I think as long as you identify, one person that needs to get that ducting fitted for you, you're not going to have that debate on site. You'll just foresee that potential issue that could arise. Also types of flooring as well. So if they need to lift so say if they're going for, say if you're not going wall to wall with tiles, or you're not tiling first, you want to wait until your kitchen's fitted to then tile slightly under the furniture, which is usually really popular to do. If you're going for sort of like a stick down flooring or like a laminate, sometimes if it's a stick down, you have a self leveler go on before the kitchen is fitted. And then usually sometimes the fitter needs to lift the panels up slightly in order for tiles to be fixed, to be put underneath them. So again, identifying that just prior to your installation, and just make sure that your fitter knows what type of flooring you're going for. Equally, if it's a case of you've got sort of your ceiling height, and maybe it's quite tight from a height perspective, but then you've got to put a self leveler on, you've then got to put like a big thick tile on. Again, that's going to affect your ceiling height, so this falls into this sort of type of flooring category as well. Just making sure that everyone's aware of what's being fitted, just so then if there's any sort of unforeseen circumstances that maybe you guys have missed because you don't do renovations all the time, hopefully the experts will put their advice in, put their 10 pence in, and be like, actually, okay, this may need to be reconsidered because of X, Y, and Z. Might just be that you need to have a smaller cornice maybe on your furniture. So it's really that these issues and things to consider are really easy to overcome if it's organised and foreseen before. It's more stress when it's part of or during the installation, because that's when you're without a kitchen, so naturally everything's always heightened. So trying to just forward think everything as much as possible is ideal in this circumstance. As I mentioned, renovations aren't easy. There's going to be lots of uncertainties, especially if this is your first sort of renovation project. It can be really scary and daunting. So we get it. And I think that's why I'm loving doing, the Love Your Kitchen podcast, because it means that you can listen to or watch this in your own time and really get a feel for the factors and important things to think about, just to make sure you're, as organised as possible and can feel confident going into that kitchen renovation. As I always say at the end of every episode, if you've got any further questions or queries, please do get in touch with me. Drop any questions in the comments below, and I'll be sure to answer them, in a podcast episode. And also, if it's a case of you want me to help you from a freelance perspective with any design work, as part of one of my design packages, I can help you find the trades and suppliers and things as well. So to try and take the element and that stress from you, I can help with that as well. All you'd need to do is just reach out to me on any of our social channels, which is at Love Your Kitchen Podcast. Or if you want to sort of message me directly through my website, it's www.fayenewmandesign.com, and I'll be more than happy to help. Part 2 of this episode will launch next week. There's so much to go through when we're talking about sort of, unforeseen sort of circumstances and bumps in the road. So I wanted to make sure that you've got 2 episodes that are, full of all the relevant content to make sure that, you are fully ready for your upcoming kitchen renovation. So if you've really enjoyed this episode, what you can do is subscribe, and then of course you'll get a notification next week when the second episode or part 2 of this episode will, come out and hopefully help you with some more, top tips and just things to consider and make sure that's sorted prior to your installation, and if something goes wrong, how to manage that situation. As I mentioned, kitchens can be quite scary, or renovations can be quite scary, so it's just making sure that you're really informed and that you're ready for that kitchen project. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you have liked what we have spoken about, why not like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Also, what you can do is click on the notification bell to keep yourself notified of all the new content to come.